My son brought his wife into the courtroom and smiled at me like I was already finished. I thought about a moment 32 years earlier. I was crouched behind a filing cabinet in a basement office in Ottawa, listening to a man explain to his colleague exactly how he'd been defrauding the federal pension program for 6 years. He didn't know I was there. He thought the room was empty. That was always my advantage. I was very good at being invisible. My name is not important for this story. What matters is that I'm 67 years old. I live in a semi-detached house in Oakville, Ontario, and for 28 years I worked as a forensic financial investigator for the Canada Revenue Agency. Not the glamorous side, not audits, not tax season, the other side, the side where people go to prison. I retired 4 years ago. I planted a garden. I learned to make a proper sourdough. I drove my granddaughter to soccer on Saturday mornings, and I thought that was the rest of my life, and I was happy with it. I should start from where it actually started, which was a Tuesday in March, about 14 months before the courtroom. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is and what he'll always be, regardless of what he allowed to happen, came for dinner with his wife. They'd been married 3 years by then. She was younger than him by almost a decade, worked in financial planning, had a very deliberate smile. The kind of smile that arrives a half second after the eyes. I noticed that the first time I met her, but I told myself I was being an old woman who didn't want to share her boy. That Tuesday, over chicken and rice, she mentioned she'd been thinking about my finances. I said I hadn't asked her to. She laughed, touched my son's arm, said she just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. That the house was a lot for one person. That there were options, if I ever felt overwhelmed. My son nodded along like she was reading from a script he'd already approved. I changed the subject. After they left, I stood at the kitchen sink and washed the dishes and told myself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Over the next 3 months, she called me every week. Always friendly, always helpful. She sent me articles about senior living communities. The nice ones, the ones with the walking paths and the communal gardens. She offered to help me consolidate my accounts. Said it would be simpler. Said she could manage everything so I didn't have to worry. She started referring to my house as the property, like it was already an asset to be distributed rather than a home where I'd raised a child. My son started calling me more too, asking if I was sleeping all right. Had he seen the doctor recently? Was I eating properly? He came by one Sunday and watched me make tea and said very gently that I seemed tired, that he'd noticed I repeated myself sometimes. I had not repeated myself. I was not tired. I knew exactly what was happening. I've spent nearly 3 decades watching people establish narratives. It's a particular skill, creating the impression that someone is diminished. You start small. You express concern publicly. You document perceived lapses. You make the person doubt themselves, or you make everyone around them doubt the person. By the time anyone questions the narrative, it's already the truth in the room. She was doing it methodically, and she was doing it well. I'll give her that. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront them. I did what I always did when I suspected something. I started keeping records. I wrote down every call, every visit, every comment. I noted the date my son first suggested, very casually, that I should maybe think about giving someone power of attorney while I was still sharp enough to make that decision. I noted the date she offered, for the 3rd time, to help me move my savings into an account she managed. Something simpler, she called it. I noted when they brought a younger couple to Sunday dinner, friends of theirs, and the husband spent the evening talking to me about a condo development in Burlington that was a wonderful investment for people in my situation. People in my situation. 67, widowed, living alone in a house that, according to the most recent assessment, was worth just over $1 million too. I am not a paranoid person. I've seen enough actual fraud to recognize when something isn't fraud. This was fraud. What I didn't know yet was the scale of it. In May, I asked a former colleague, a woman I'd worked with for 15 years, now retired but still sharp, to do something quiet for me. I gave her the name of my daughter-in-law's financial planning practice. I asked her to make some inquiries. Nothing official. Just looking. She called me back in 10 days. She said, "You need to hear this in person." We sat in her kitchen in Mississauga and she laid it out. My daughter-in-law had 3 complaints filed against her with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario in the past 2 years. 2 had been resolved quietly. clients who were elderly, who'd accepted settlements and signed non-disclosure agreements. The third was still pending. A woman in her 80s, in Hamilton, whose daughter had finally noticed that significant amounts had been moved from her mother's accounts into a management fund that the daughter had never heard of. Unauthorized transfers. Forged signatures. The kind of thing that is very hard to prove when the victim has been carefully established as confused and forgetful. I drove home from Mississauga, and I sat in my driveway for a long time. My son was not a bad person. I needed to hold on to that. He was a person who loved a woman who was not who she'd told him she was, and he had been slowly, carefully shaped into someone who'd started to see his mother as a problem to be managed rather than a person. That happens. It happens to good people. But it was still happening, and I was not going to let it happen to me. The following month, my daughter-in-law sat across from me at my kitchen table. My son was in the bathroom, we were alone for maybe 4 minutes, and she said, very quietly, that she really did think it would be better for everyone if I considered the power of attorney soon. She said my son worried. She said she worried. She said she only wanted to protect me. I looked at her, and I said I appreciated her concern. She smiled, the smile that didn't reach her eyes. I smiled back. Mine reached mine. I had started recording our conversations 3 weeks earlier. The small device was in the side pocket of the cardigan I wore almost every day. In Ontario, only one party in a conversation needs to consent to a recording. I had consented to every single one. By August, I had enough. Not just the recordings. Those were supporting material. What I had, through my former colleague and a retired RCMP officer I'd known for years and 2 very careful months of my own work, was a documented pattern. Dates, amounts, account numbers for 2 of her other clients. A paper trail that showed she had been, for at least 4 years, systematically targeting elderly clients, moving their assets under the guise of management and funneling portions into accounts that led, eventually, back to a numbered company registered in New Brunswick. My son's name was not on any of it. That was important. That meant he was salvageable. I made 1 phone call to the FSRA investigator handling the Hamilton case. I didn't explain who I was at first. I told her I had material relevant to her open file. When she asked for my background, I gave it to her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" I told her I'd needed to be thorough. She said, "Of course you did." We met the following week. I handed over everything I'd compiled. She looked at it for a long time and said it would take a few months to build the formal case. I said I understood. I told her about the power of attorney pressure, the suggestions about my accounts. She asked if I wanted to be listed as a complainant in addition to providing investigative support. I said yes. In the meantime, I kept going to Sunday dinners. I kept answering my son's calls about whether I was sleeping all right. I said yes, I was sleeping beautifully. I kept accepting my daughter-in-law's helpful forwarded articles about retirement communities. I saved every single one. In October, my son called me and said he needed to talk to me about something serious. He came over alone. First time in a while. He sat at the kitchen table and said that he and his wife had been speaking to a lawyer, that they were considering, given their concerns about my well-being, applying for a formal guardianship assessment. He said the word concerned 4 times. He didn't look at me the whole time. I listened. I nodded. I asked him one question. Whose idea was it? He said it was both of theirs. I looked at my son and I thought about every hockey practice in the cold at 6 in the morning, every school meeting, every late night when he was scared, every year I drove an extra 40 minutes each way so he could go to the better school. I thought about standing at his father's grave with him when he was 19 and telling him that we would be all right and meaning it. Then I said, "I think you should speak to your wife about where this idea actually came from." He left confused. He didn't call for 2 weeks. The formal charges were laid in February, 11 counts involving 6 clients, total amount just over $340,000, modest compared to some cases I'd worked, but substantial enough. The Hamilton complainant was the lead case. I was secondary. 2 other clients, once contacted by investigators, agreed to come forward as well. The first court date was a Monday. I wore my good gray coat. I took the GO train, which I prefer to driving downtown. I walked into the courthouse on Main Street, a building I testified in twice during my career, though always as an investigator rather than a complainant, and I found my seat. My son was already there. He was sitting behind his wife. He had not called me to say he'd be there. He looked up when I walked in, and his face went through about 6 different things in 2 seconds. He hadn't expected me. I think he had genuinely believed I wouldn't come, that I'd be too confused or too intimidated or too whatever he'd convinced himself I was over the past year. His wife looked at me and then looked away quickly. The Crown prosecutor was a composed woman in her 40s who nodded at me when I sat down. The defense attorney was someone I didn't recognize. Her client, my daughter-in-law, sat very still. When the judge came in and the proceedings began, the prosecutor introduced the investigative record and began outlining the evidentiary chain. At one point, she referenced the secondary complainant's contribution to the investigation, not by name but by professional background. The defense attorney objected to something, and the judge looked at the supporting documentation, and then he looked up and he looked at me, and I saw the recognition move across his face. He'd been a Crown attorney himself in the 90s. We had worked briefly on the periphery of the same case, a securities fraud matter that had taken 3 years to prosecute. He said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Is that?" and then stopped. The prosecutor said without inflection that the secondary complainant had extensive background in forensic financial investigation. He looked at me again. I looked back at him. My son, sitting 2 rows behind me, leaned forward. I heard him say to someone beside him very quietly, "What's happening?" What was happening was that the careful, soft-spoken woman his wife had spent 14 months framing as declining and overwhelmed had spent the last 8 months of that time building a case that made the existing investigation airtight. What was happening was that the woman they'd thought they were managing had managed them the entire time. The proceedings took several months to fully resolve. She eventually pleaded guilty to 6 of the 11 counts. The sentencing included restitution to all clients, a permanent ban from working in financial services in Canada, and 2 years less a day, to be served conditionally given her circumstances and the absence of a prior record. I will not tell you I was satisfied with that outcome. I will tell you I understood it, which is a different thing. My son called me the night of the plea. He cried, not the polite kind, the real kind, where a person sounds like they're trying to hold their own ribs together. I let him. I didn't fill the silence with reassurance he hadn't earned yet. After a while, I said, "I knew you weren't part of it." He said, "How?" I said, "Because I know you." He said he was sorry. He said he didn't understand how he'd believed it, how he'd looked at me and started seeing exactly what she'd described. He said he was ashamed. I said he was ashamed. I said he was ashamed. I said, "She was good at it. It was her profession. You fell in love with someone who wasn't who she said she was, and then she worked on you as much as she worked on me. That's not stupidity. That's just being human." He came for dinner the following Sunday. He sat in the same chair he'd sat in as a child. I made the chicken and rice because it's what he's always liked, even though he claims now as a grown man that rice is too plain for him. He ate 2 helpings. We didn't talk about it all evening. We talked about my granddaughter's soccer team, which had made it to the regional tournament. We talked about the garden, which needed work now that it was spring again. At the end of the night, when he was putting on his coat, he stopped in the front hall and looked around at the house. My house, his childhood house, the house that had very nearly become the property. And he said, quietly, "I'm glad it's still here." I said, "I'm glad you're still here. That's the part I think about now, more than the courtroom. More than the recordings or the documents or the quiet satisfaction of watching a very thorough case come together. I think about the fact that the same skills that took me 32 years to develop, the patience, the careful documentation, the ability to stay invisible while everything was observed, also kept me from reacting too early, from saying something out of hurt or anger that would have given her warning, from losing my son in the process of trying to expose the person standing beside him. I spent nearly 3 decades learning that the long way around is often the only way that actually works. I am 67 years old. I have a sourdough starter on the counter that needs feeding. My granddaughter has a tournament in 2 weekends, and I've already arranged the drive. There are people who looked at me and saw something that was winding down. I suppose I understand why. I don't particularly look like someone who spent the better part of 3 decades making people answer for what they thought they'd gotten away with. But then, that was always the point. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this ended. Not in any grand philosophical way, I'm too practical for that, but in the plain, observable way that a person thinks about it when they've spent nearly 3 decades watching decisions compound into consequences. My daughter-in-law made choices. She made them deliberately over years because she'd done it before and it had worked before and no one had ever looked closely enough to stop her. That's the thing about patterns. They feel safer the longer they go uninterrupted. She got careless. Not reckless, but careless in the specific way that people get careless when they've decided the person across from them isn't capable of fighting back. That assumption was the only real mistake she made. Everything else she executed quite well. My son made choices too, and I think his are the ones I spent more time sitting with. He chose, gradually and probably without fully realizing it, to see me through her eyes, to interpret her concern as love and her narrative as truth. That's not a character failing. It's just what happens when someone you trust keeps quietly reshaping the story. By the time you notice, you're already inside the version they built for you. I don't hold it against him, but I also don't pretend it didn't happen. What I keep returning to is this: the qualities that protected me weren't dramatic. They weren't courage in the obvious sense. They were patience and precision and the willingness to stay quiet when every instinct said to speak. I learned those things slowly, over decades, in rooms where speaking too soon ruined everything. That training wasn't something I chose in a moment of crisis. It was something I'd built over years because the work demanded it when I actually needed it. In my own kitchen, in my own life, it was simply there. I think that's the part worth holding on to. The things we develop over a lifetime don't disappear because we've retired. The judgment, the steadiness, the ability to observe without reacting. Those don't have an expiry date. The people who counted on me being diminished weren't wrong to think that time changes a person. They were wrong about the direction of the change. The evening my son ate 2 helpings of chicken and rice and said he was glad the house was still there, that was the moment I knew we'd be all right. Not fixed, not exactly as we were before, but all right. Some things break cleanly and heal cleanly. Other things break in a more complicated way, and the healing is more complicated too. That's not a tragedy. That's just how it goes when the damage was done slowly. I'm still here. The house is still mine. My granddaughter won her tournament. The sourdough, I'll admit, took 3 attempts this spring to get right again after I'd neglected it through everything, but it got there.